Dr. Kirsty Sword Gusmão, Order of Australia, who was educated at the University of Melbourne and Monash University. For two decades, Kirsty worked for Timor-Leste to realise its right to self-determination, and after the nation became independent in 2002, has contributed to the rebuilding of the country through her women's organisation, the Alola Foundation, and a range of education-related initiatives. As the chair of Timor-Leste's first National Commission for UNESCO, she advocated for a greater role for Timor-Leste's 17 Indigenous languages in the education system and a more prominent role for Indigenous knowledge systems in national development. And I'm really excited to hear what Kirsty has to say on the topic of language, learning and identity in Timor-Leste. Thank you, Kirsty.
Unmute.
Thanks so much for that lovely welcome. Good morning, bon dia, everybody. Importantly, on this day, may I begin by acknowledging the Indigenous owners of the land on which we meet today and pay respects to their elders. To honour them, and because I'm going to talk quite a bit about the importance of language and identity today, I'd like to begin by quoting from the findings of the 2011 New South Wales Inquiry into Language Learning in Indigenous Communities, which states, "Language connects us with our ancestors. It stores our history and knowledge, progressed over thousands of years, and ties us to our country and to each other. Language use expresses our way of being and of seeing the world." Now, I have a little PowerPoint presentation. I'll just share that with you now. So I'm delighted to have been asked to speak to you on this special day, which celebrates and calls attention to the importance of Indigenous knowledge systems for the understandings of our world and natural environment that they hold, and for the rich stories of human civilization that they tell. I'm going to talk to you today about a passion of mine, well, actually a couple of passions. One of the little half-island nation of Timor-Leste, which I'm privileged to call my second homeland, and the other that of language, specifically Indigenous languages, and the important role that they play in all human societies, but particularly in post-colonial and multilingual settings. I'm going to talk to you about our efforts in Timor-Leste to run a mother tongue-based multilingual education pilot program in 3 municipalities of Timor-Leste, and some of the practical and intensely political obstacles that we have faced along the way. But first, by way of an introduction to me and the above mentioned passions, here is a bit of my background. So I'm a teacher by training. I did my arts degree and a dip ed at Melbourne Uni in the 1980s. And it was during my undergraduate studies that I came to know a number of East Timorese students and the plight of their homeland. Hearing their own tales of persecution and the horrors of the Indonesian occupation of the territory, my conscience as an Australian was pricked. As a student of languages, specifically Indonesian and Italian, I started translating reports of human rights violations and helped my friends to disseminate these widely. My journey to full-time and devoted advocate of independence for Timor-Leste was fast-tracked by the experience of working in 1991 as a member of a film crew which captured the Santa Cruz massacre on film. By the following year, I had moved to Jakarta and joined forces with the increasingly bold pro-democracy movement within the country. Fast forward to 2002 and the newly independent Timor-Leste was grappling with rebuilding a shattered nation after the violence of 1999. It was also establishing all the key institutions of state from scratch and making vitally important decisions on issues such as systems of government, currency, and choice of official language. The country's leaders opted for Portuguese, the language of the former colonial power, alongside Tetum, the lingua franca amongst some 17 local Indigenous languages. Whilst both Portuguese and Tetum enjoyed the same status within the new state, and Article 13 of the Constitution of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste declares the nation's commitment to promoting and developing Tetum and the country's other native languages, Portuguese was favoured as the language of instruction within the school system. Tetum, which had hitherto been principally a spoken language amongst most Timorese, was not deemed to be well suited to the transmission of knowledge and science. There was only one small but important complicating factor with this policy decision, and that was that only about 25% of the population spoke Portuguese with any degree of fluency, and amongst teachers, standards of proficiency were sorely lacking. It's perhaps not surprising, therefore, that in 2009, when the World Bank conducted its first early grade reading assessment, 70% of grade 2 students could not read a single line of text in either Portuguese or Tetum. And in fact, disturbing numbers of students continue to spend 3 to 4 years at primary school without learning to read or write. So back in 2009, I had just been sworn in as the chair of the newly minted Timor-Leste National Commission for UNESCO. I'd done a lot of reading about UNESCO's work at promoting and supporting mother tongue-based multilingual education programs around the world, and I could see their importance and relevance for Timor. Not only were there advantages for children's learning, but also conferring status on Indigenous languages by making them languages of the classroom contributes to their preservation. Census data reveals that year upon year, more Timorese are opting to speak and teach their children Tetum over their first language. As I mentioned earlier, this first language could be one of roughly 17 local languages, of which the majority are Austronesian and a handful are Papuan in origin. Each one is distinct and unique and encodes a vast array of traditional knowledge in the form of insights into the ways of the spirit world, the uses of plants for traditional medicine, care for and preservation of the land and waterways, and much else. Dr. Lisa Palmer's book, Island Encounters, which we will be launching shortly, offers a glimpse into the richness and importance of this traditional knowledge for the identity and well-being of the Timorese people and their land. When a language becomes extinct, and at least one of those 17 Timorese languages is no longer spoken, a community's grasp on that precious traditional knowledge becomes tenuous. To come back to my work for the Timor-Leste National Commission for UNESCO, so as a teacher, it concerned me a great deal that kids were not able to understand their teachers in the classroom and that teachers were struggling to teach effectively given their requirement that they teach the curriculum in Portuguese. As a lover of languages, it was troubling to me that Timor-Leste's Indigenous languages were becoming extinct and that nobody in positions of power in the country seemed to care very much. Because it seemed counterintuitive, nobody believed me and my colleagues at the National Commission when we said that kids would learn Tetum and Portuguese better if they had a chance to acquire their initial literacy in their mother tongue. So we decided to establish a mother tongue-based multilingual education pilot program in 12 pre-primary and primary schools in 3 of Timor-Leste's 13 municipalities. As a precursor to this work, we ran workshops in Dili and in the 3 pilot municipalities to raise awareness of the importance of Timor-Leste's Indigenous languages in and of themselves, but also as a means of helping kids to achieve success at school. Perhaps because an election was looming and my then husband and Prime Minister, Alola Gusmão, had thrown his weight behind the mother tongue program, I found myself verbally and almost physically assaulted at one such workshop by a group of agitated protesters who claimed that promoting Timor-Leste's mother tongues was divisive and an attempt to drag Timor-Leste's education system backwards. We were forced to abandon the workshop. If it had gone ahead, we would have had a chance to address precisely these concerns and remind those present that the determination to defend Timor-Leste's unique cultural and linguistic identity was what had won the people their national independence at great human cost. Regardless of these early setbacks, the Mother Tongue Pilot Program went ahead with overwhelming support from the school communities involved. We were also fortunate to have the technical advice and inputs of Professor Jolo Bianco, former Professor of Language and Literacy Education at the Melbourne Uni Graduate School of Education, who assisted us with drafting a national language and education policy for Timor-Leste. An evaluation of the pilot program conducted in 2016 showed that grade 2 students in the mother tongue schools are learning to read far more rapidly than children attending the Portuguese reference schools, which are staffed by teachers from Portugal and enjoy facilities and resources far superior to regular public schools. In fact, in tests of reading ability, grade 2 students in the mother tongue schools were performing 25 percentage points better than children in the Portuguese schools. And in other subject areas too, including mathematics and even Portuguese language, the kids in the mother tongue program were excelling. Anecdotally too, and very importantly, we know that the parents and families of children in the pilot schools are taking a much more active interest in their children's learning than ever before. In spite of the significant initial outlay required for the development of standard orthographies and simple learning materials for hitherto largely oral languages, the mother tongue program in Timor-Leste is far less costly and significantly more effective than other educational models. Most importantly, it's ensuring that no child is left behind in the classroom. And of course, inclusion and negotiation of new, more equitable social contracts are the focus of this year's International Day of the World's Indigenous People. A large body of evidence, including the findings from mother tongue-based multilingual and bilingual pilot programs from around the world, including Australia, stress the importance of use of a child's first language for literacy and early learning, not only for better educational outcomes, but for the well-being, sense of belonging and social connectedness of the child. Sadly, 40% of the global population does not access education in a language they understand, and a large number of those would, of course, be Indigenous people. Unfortunately, too, politicians and government bureaucrats, perhaps because in most places around the world they are from social elites and members of the dominant ethno-linguistic group in society, are content to be guided in their policy decisions by ill-informed and often chauvinistic public opinion. This has certainly been the case in Timor-Leste, where government support for the pilot program has recently been cut back, and calls from minority language communities to join the program have been rejected. I know that in Indigenous communities in Australia also, attempts to promote the teaching of Aboriginal languages in the school system have been at the whim of the revolving door of federal and state politicians. Next year sees the beginning of the decade of Indigenous languages. I hope that the momentum for change and growing recognition of the importance of Indigenous languages for sustainable development will gain pace over that period, here in Australia, in Timor-Leste, and indeed around the globe. Thank you so much for listening to me today, and I'm very happy to take any questions that anyone might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. It was really informative, and it's really glad we could bring, despite the restrictions that the world's facing right now, bring an international perspective, because the Institute and the plights of Indigenous people are a global thing, not just idiosyncratic to Australia. So for me, this really just reinforces the importance of the theme this year, which is the omission, if you like, of Indigenous peoples around the world from the implicit social contract that society is based upon. And in this way, it's manifest in the way that you've elucidated, in terms of essentially excluding people from education and learning because of their inability to understand, and the unwillingness of the dominant societies to communicate in languages that they can understand. Can you elucidate some of, I don't want to make this too negative and we'll move into some more positive questions, but elucidate some of the issues that have arisen from this exclusion, if you like, from the knowledge systems or the education system. In other areas, it results in inability to access fair wages and economic opportunity. And are they the sort of outcomes that have occurred and continue to occur in Timor-Leste because of this situation?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's been referred to a number of times this morning already, how, education offers pathways into, power positions within government systems, and also economic power. And, what we see is that minority language communities in Timor-Leste, particularly in the more remote parts of the country where less Tetum and Portuguese are spoken, that kids are not succeeding. They already have tremendous pressures on them from their parents, who are in all likelihood subsistence farmers. And so when those children, after 2 years, are not learning to read and write, their parents question whether or not the time that they're spending in the classroom is actually time well spent, and whether or not they wouldn't be better actually helping on the farm, out in the fields. So those kids who are already disadvantaged become then further disadvantaged, and then that then spirals and increases the inequities that exist within society. And of course, those urban dwelling populations, political elites, have in all likelihood actually attended school in one of the dominant languages, either Tetum or Portuguese. So they're more likely to get the jobs. Jobs in civil service particularly require a certain level of proficiency in both Tetum and Portuguese. So automatically those rural minority language communities are disadvantaged in terms of getting a seat at the table, whether that's in a business setting or, in a governance setting at the national level.
Yeah, there's so many parallels everywhere. It's one of the forms of control, isn't it? So might try for one more quick question. I guess we've got a few here, but I'll choose this one. So the language progression plan, is it connected, the one in Timor-Leste, to any other Portuguese colonies and their rate of progress in educating Indigenous people, for example, Brazilian Indigenous people?
I'm not aware of any similar programs in Brazil, and I'm not sure whether the language progression plan in Timor-Leste would match what they're doing there. But certainly when we developed that transition plan, we had the advice of a number of international experts, including Professor Joe Lobianco, who was drawing on his experience of working with huge numbers of minority language communities around the region, you know, the Pacific region, but also all around the world, including some African and South American countries. So I mean, it is tailored to Timor's specific circumstances. Of course, you know, it's very complex because you have, you know, kids not having to learn one foreign, if you like, language or a non-home language, but they're having to learn Tetum, Portuguese, and then at secondary level, English. So ideally, they would actually be able to transition a little bit longer to the second language, but because of the requirement that they also learn Portuguese before they enter high school, the transition happens probably a little bit earlier than what would be recommended internationally.
All right, thank you. Thanks for answering that question.